Welcome. Today we are talking about CBS Knowledge Standard 6, Knowledge of the Principles of Relational Frame Theory, or RFT. If you've made it through the earlier videos, thank you for your perseverance. We're going to go a little bit faster. I think the introduction to what is functional contextualism and some of the key pieces about operant and respondent conditioning are so important that we went through those in some depth. RFT is also important, but I think starting here and into the next set of knowledge standards, we'll take a little bit of a kind of a higher level, quicker approach, and you can dive in if there's more that you need to understand or want to explore with these things. So I think we're ready to kind of move a little quicker. So today, I'm going to kind of talk about RFT almost the way I would at a dinner party. So you can imagine if you had sort of an interested undergrad and they said, oh, tell me about RFT. Might not be the most fun dinner party, but maybe not. So we could do it. And I think part of what happens is RFT has kind of this reputation for being very difficult to understand, and I'm going to try to not reinforce that story today by showing how I think pretty quickly, with just some basic understanding of operant principles, we can understand what RFT is about. So at my dinner party, the origin story, I would talk about Maurice Sidman, who was a behavior analyst back in 1971, who discovered something that hadn't been reported before. So he was trying to help folks with intellectual disabilities, learn to read. And what he noticed is what you're seeing in this picture here is that if someone had already knew that when you say the word cat, that it refers to these kind of four-legged fuzzy things, right? Pictures or actual cats. So they could link those two things. So say the word cat and then they point to the cat or that kind of thing. And if they knew that, and then if you taught them that saying the word cat was equivalent to these written letters of C, A, and T, um, then you could get some new emergent phenomena that hadn't been seen before. So, for example, they had never been directly taught that the letters C, A, and T were linked to this picture of a cat. And yet, with those two kind of relations being taught, they saw the emergence of these untrained relations between the letters C, A, T, and the picture cat, and then the responses. So that kind of new observation was called stimulus equivalence. And it was the subject of ongoing research, but there was a lot of basic research that was done in the 70s and into the 80s. And then when Steve Hayes heard about it, basically he put his spin on it, saying that this could be considered a form of operant behavior. And that is how we got to the birth of RFT. So if we're teaching RFT at a dinner party, what we want to do is quickly have people understand two key terms. One is called Ring, so arbitrarily applicable relational responding, and the other term is derived relational responding. And as I said, as long as someone's got kind of the basic idea of operant learning in place, we can work with it. So you could draw this on a piece of paper or draw this on a napkin. We're going to set up our operant terms, and we're going to use a four-term contingency in this case because we're really going to need to use those conditional stimulus. So we've got a space for conditional stimulus. We've got our standard ABC, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And then just for the sake of simplicity, um, we're gonna always say that the consequence is social praise. So like a caregiver saying like good job. Those are not the only consequences, of course, that matter that set this up. But just for the sake of our learning, we're just going to hold that constant and just say that the consequences are always just going to be social praise. So we're going to build out our AARR. Let's build it out. So we start with the last R, responding. Pretty easy to understand. Antecedent stimulus, in this case, it is an American coin, a nickel, and we want the person to respond to it. And so the response could be of any kind. They could point to it, they could grab it, they could say that one, some kind of response. And then, of course, we're going to give our attempt to reinforce that through a consequence, saying good job. So that's responding. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now we're going to talk about two R's, relational responding. So our antecedent stimulus, now we're going to have two. So we have two stimuli. We have the nickel and we have the American dime. And we're also going to use a conditional stimulus here. So the parent's going to say pick one to indicate that we want them to respond to one of these two things. So they're going to respond on some basis. We don't necessarily know what that is, but they're going to make some response to these two stimuli, right? They're going to show a preference for one of the coins through pointing or touching, grabbing it, saying something, and we're going to praise good job, right? So relational responding just means responding on the basis of some kind of relationship between two or more stimuli. So they're responding on the basis of these two stimuli. So we've got relational responding going on. Now we're going to add a middle term here. We don't see this as much, but NARR, so non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So um, stimuli can have arbitrary properties that we just sort of decide by social whim, but they also have non-arbitrary properties. In this case, we know that the nickel is physically larger and heavier than the dime. So there are some non-arbitrary properties of size and weight that are non-arbitrary. So we have our two stimuli, and now the parent says, pick the big one. And in this case, the child has to make a response picking the nickel. That's the only one that's going to get the praise of good job, right? So we are going to reinforce the development of this NAR response, this non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. Pretty straightforward. Pick the bigger one. Now we are going to start introducing the AARR, the arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And so here we want the child to make a response that's based on some arbitrary property of the stimulus, and that is determined by social whim, by just choice of the verbal community. So here the parent says, pick the one worth more. And if you know your American coins, you know that the nickel is arbitrarily defined as being worth 5 cents, and the dime is arbitrarily defined as being worth 10 cents. So on the basis of that value, the dime is worth more. So initially, kids might respond to the nickel. It looks bigger, it's physically bigger. We are not going to reinforce that. We're going to ignore or punish that. But when we say, in the presence of pick the one worth more, and they pick the dime, we are going to praise that and reinforce that. And that is helping them to develop this arbitrarily applicable relational responding, where they are responding on the basis of something being worth more that may or may not be connected to the actual physical properties of that stimulus in front of them. So they're picking the more valuable dime. Now, of course, over time, we don't do this just with nickels and dimes. We do this with all kinds of things. So we talk about this idea of things being worth more in lots of different examples. And so over time, as they learn that with nickels and dimes, and small desserts being tastier than bigger desserts, they can come to abstract this out and essentially learn how to use the worth more kind of framing, where in the presence of any two stimuli, they can make a response about which one is worth more. And it's going to be consistent with their established learning history. So you can try this for yourself. So if you are fluent in English, then you would have had a lot of history already to help you develop fluency with arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And we can see how this would work. So if we take two stimuli that you've never probably directly compared before, so let's say like plant seeds, heirloom tomato seeds, and other things like that, and the Magna Carta, the kind of critical early legal document that's the basis for a lot of democratic rights later on. You've probably never been asked to compare those two things before. But if I ask you, pick the one that is worth more. Notice how quickly you're able to do that. You can sort of sort through that, start to see ways, and you can probably come up with an answer. You probably honestly could defend either one, but just notice that you could make an answer that makes sense, that shows uh, you understand how to compare these things and use this arbitrary term of worth in ways that you've never been asked to before, but that work very fluently because of your long training history with this kind of relating. So we've done it very quickly. At our dinner party, we've introduced this concept of arbitrarily applicable relational responding, core of RFT. Now, there's a couple other details that might be worth unpacking if your friend at the dinner party is not run off, and that is that this kind of relating is under contextual control. So when we talk about different kind of relations, obviously there's lots of different kinds, and they could be based on lots of different things. So when we're talking more technically about this kind of relating, there's two important technical terms that we use. So CREL refers to the stimulus that's going to specify what kind of a relational response is going to be reinforced, or what are we looking for, right? So sometimes when we say, is that the same? We're asking for a relational response based on sameness. When we ask which one's bigger, which one's smaller, right? It's a different kind of frame. So the stimulus that tells us what kind of relation we're looking for is called CREL. And then we're also interested in specific kind of functional properties. So when we ask which one is bigger in the case of the nickel versus the dime, in some ways we're being ambiguous, right? Because we don't. It's hard to know from that if the person means which one is more physically bigger, or which one is bigger in terms of value. And the cues, the stimuli that are going to tell us which functional uh, property are we attending to is what we call C-funk. So in that initial case with the nickel and dime, the C-funk was somewhat ambiguous, but I could make it a lot more explicit, right? Because I could ask like, which one of these is physically bigger, right? Or which one is worth more? So I've got a table here to give some examples of how this works. So when we talk about like a relational frame of say comparison, so here we're talking about like more than, less than, that's a frame of like comparison. There isn't like this absolute like this is exactly the way that we say it. It's remember it's an operant that's defined by its functional properties, by what it does. And so on the left column, I'm giving examples of the kinds of questions that you would hear over and over as you're a child growing up that would help you develop this CREL and know what kind of relating is being asked, right? So show me which one's bigger, which one is more, pick the best one, which one is not the smallest. All of those are helping you build kind of those an understanding of the sort of CRELs, what kind of frame is being asked for here. And the same thing too, when we talk to kids, we are also doing a lot of training on kind of C-funks, right? So if we're trying to help them understand kind of that non-arbitrary physical size, we're going to ask them things like, which one takes up more space? Which one can cover the other one? Which one's taller and wider? But if we're wanting them to understand some other kind of functional relationship, maybe one that's arbitrary, right? Like monetary value, we ask different questions, right? Like, which one can buy you more candy? No, not the nickel, it's the dime. Which one's worth twice as much as the other? The dime. Which one would you want Santa to bring? The dime, because it buys more candy. And as we move into other ones, I'll give you this other example here of, let's say, C-funk around this idea of beauty. So beauty is also an arbitrary applicable. It's just determined by social whim, what we call, kind of beautiful, not beautiful. But it's important. It's an important arbitrary category that we want kids to learn. And so when we're training that, we're going to ask questions like, which one is prettier? Which one do you think your sister would say is cute? Which one do you like to look at more? And we're trying to help them understand how to do this kind of relating of more than, less than, in different kinds of functional categories, physical size, monetary value. prettiness, all the kinds of things that we need all the different ways of relating in the world that we need. And so we use this multiple exemplar training, questions and questions and questions, and these kind of reinforcements, so that over time, if things go well, people abstract that and they know exactly how to use these C-RELs and these C-funcs to relate any stimuli that they might encounter in the world, in novel ways, in ways that they'd never been asked to before. That's the basis of arbitrarily applicable relational responding under the control of C-REL and C-func. All right, so there I am at my dinner party, and my companion has started to understand a little bit about what we're talking about with arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And now, before they run away, I want to make sure that I highlight some of the key features of relational framing so that they can go out and teach others. So, as an example, I will use what is called the Tri-Cities in Washington State. And so the Tri-Cities refer to three specific cities: Kennewick, Pasco, and Richland. Got them up here. You can see there's three stimuli. They can be related in infinite number of ways. I haven't spent much time in the Tri-Cities myself, but I have it on good authority that Kennewick is more fun than Richland. And so I put that into my diagram here. I've got this arrow pointing from Kennewick to Richland saying more fun. And I note that this is a directly trained relation. So I was directly taught from somebody that Kennewick is more fun than Richland. So that's all I have so far. But if Kennewick is more fun than Richland, then we can reverse this relation and say that Richland is less fun than Kennewick. And in RFT, this is the principle of mutual entailment. In other words, Kennewick being more fun than Richland mutually entails that Richland is less fun than Kennewick. And I mark that with the arrow going to the left, and I put it in the dotted lines to show that this is an untrained relation. So the person didn't tell me that piece. I just completed it by completing the reverse of that relation. And then my Tri-City source tells me something else. They tell me that Richland is more fun than Pasco. So I add it to my diagram. Richland pointing to Pasco. Richland is more fun than Pasco. It's a directly trained relation. So, of course, through mutual entailment, we now know that Pasco is less fun than Richland. But there are also now some relations that can be derived between Kennewick and Pasco, even though I was never directly told anything about them, right? And this is the RFT principle of combinatorial entailment. It's basically where these untrained relations are going to propagate through the network that's established. So it depends on the kind of network that is established. If it's not clear how the relations are going to propagate, then we won't see it. But in this case, we've got one that Kennewick is more fun than Richland, and Richland is more fun than Pasco. So we know, right, by combinatorial entailment, that Kennewick is more fun than Pasco, and Pasco is less fun than Kennewick. And so those are our untrained derived relations. Okay. And then the other key feature of relational frames is called the transformation of stimulus functions, right? And this is the idea that, like, not only are there going to be these kind of links between these stimuli, but that we are going to see transformations in some of the psychological functions based on the history of relating. And those are going to be controlled by those C-REL and C-func stimuli that we saw before. So in this case, we've been talking about a particular psychological function, fun. I'm kind of demonstrating that on the image here by putting it in green, right? So when we had Kennewick is more fun than Richland, I was able to put a darker green on Kennewick and a lighter green on Richland, right? Less fun. And then when I found out that Richland was more fun than Pasco, I was able to put an even lighter green on Pasco. That's what I learned. And then we can see that we can relate these things so that when I compare the funness of Kennewick to Pasco, I'm going to see that Kennewick is much more fun than Pasco. In other words, the psychological functions of fun, which if I'm somebody who knows what that means, like I have direct experience of fun, I can now sort of respond to the like things about Kennewick and Pasco, even without any direct experience, right? So someone's like, where should we go if we want to have a good time? And I'll say Kennewick. And they go, where should I send my enemy to have a bad time? And I'll say Pasco, right? Like I'll be able to, I'm able to relate these things on the basis of their funness through just these relations that um, have been established through training, right? And my ability through RFT to acquire arbitrarily applicable relational responding. If I didn't have that, then I wouldn't be able to do this. And if you do this in another language and you tell me similar kind of things, I won't have the context in that language to put this together and I won't respond well. But because I know how to relate more or less, and I can combine these, right, then I've got this easily established transformation of stimulus functions, this combinatorial entailment. I can make all kinds of useful responses between Kennewick and Pasco on the basis of fun. Um, and that is really useful, right? And when that happens, when we make this kind of response to these stimuli that is not based on our direct experience of them, but it comes through the arrangement of the stimuli in some kind of network like this, then we call that derived relational responding. So my response to Kennewick and Pasco on funness is an example of derived relational responding. And that was the second kind of key term that I wanted the person at my dinner party to understand. So, as I said, there's been a lot of experiments on stimulus equivalence and RFT. Let me give you one classic one that you'll see mentioned a lot in the literature. This is a piece of an experiment from 2007. It is not the entire experiment, but one of the key moments here is we have these arbitrary stimuli. We call them A, B, and C, but you can see on the image what they actually are. So A is these sort of three lines. B is kind of like a Z or an S or something like this. And then you've got this kind of corner C. So people are not going to have a lot of history with that, right? With those particular kind of images, right? And experimentally, that's important. You don't want to be working with a lot of past history because then you don't know if it's the past history or the current experimental history that's controlling. So in experiments, we want to use a lot of arbitrary stimuli like this. And here's basically what they do. So they repeatedly train people to, in the presence of stimulus A, pick the sort of smallest of those three. So pick smallest. In the presence of B, pick medium, and C, pick largest, right? So you get some training that you always pick, you get it. A is the smallest, B is in the middle, and C is the largest. Okay. So then they do another piece. Then they prearrange people to tell them how much shock bothers them. So they're going to get shocked, but they have some control over how much they get shocked. So they're going to get an unpleasant shock. So they show them stimulus B and they give them this unpleasant shock, right? And then in the experimental group, there's a control group that doesn't get this kind of training. But in the experimental group, they're going to give them stimulus A and they're going to give them a slightly smaller shock, right? So they got kind of a medium shock with B and then they got a smaller shock with A. And then they're going to present stimulus C and see what happens. And what you're seeing on the right is an example of what happens, representative of many, but not all of the participants in that experiment, where the amount of skin conductance that they got goes from A as the smallest, B in the middle, and C, which they never actually get shocked with C. They've never experienced it. But their skin conductance responds as if they're going to get the biggest shock of all, right? And it only happens when they have this kind of relational training of A is less than B is less than C. If that doesn't happen, you don't get this kind of transformation. So what they're showing experimentally is that by putting it in this relational frame of A is less than B is less than C, they've got this transformation of these stimulus functions, right? Of the shocks, such that there's no historical basis to say that C is going to be worse. But people who can relationally frame things are, some of them are seeing A is less than B and B is less than C. And the A shock was small and the B shock was middle. So what is the C shock going to be? It's going to be big. And that elicitation only happens for verbally competent humans that have this relational framing capacity. It doesn't happen for other organisms, right? And so that is sort of one of the experimental demonstrations of how RFT has its psychological effects. So we've just been playing around with just one kind of relational frame, right? Kind of the more than. And so again, these are not kind of like out in the world to be discovered. They're just common sort of families of responses that we tend to see in all kinds of languages. And so it's helpful to kind of look at the different families of potential relational frames. And Common ones you'll see are like conditional ones like if, right? So it can do if this, then that, like conditional frame, coordination or the sameness thing, this is the same as that. Some kind of comparison on some dimension of something being more or less. Frames of distinction, this is not that. Opposition when things are opposed to each other, right? Like heat and cold, opposites of each other. Spatial locations where things are located. Temporal frames, timing, when. Special class that we call deictic or deictic frames. These are basically ones where the frame depends on your perspective and it shifts. So we commonly see this with person. So I and you are different, right? And I depends on the perspective. When it's me, when you point to me, I say I. When I point to you, I say you. But of course, you say I because you are I. So I and you are perspective frames here and there. So if I'm here, this is here. If I walk over there, then suddenly there becomes here. It's specific to my perspective. And now and then. So in this moment, I can say it is now. But then I wait 2 seconds, and that moment that I just said was now is now then, 2 seconds ago. And another key frame is what we call hierarchical, where we are focusing on parts that are part of a whole, right? So like cinnamon is in the category of spices, right? So there's a hierarchical frame where spices hold things like cinnamon and thyme and basil and things like that. So those are some of the common frames that we will see. There's a nice handout here from Los Brigado and Shaw where they talk about these frames and they give clinical examples of how we would use them in our questions or responses to talk about kind of the things that show up in a clinical session. So we're talking about using kind of these RFT frames for transforming pain into purpose. So using these frames in our clinical intervention to help support our clinical goals, right? So this kind of applied use of RFT. Now, in real life, of course, there are all kinds of relational frames going on in particular sort of speech. As we listen to a client session, we're going to hear all kinds of different frames, and they may be mixed and matched. So I wanted to highlight that when you see sort of the kind of intro examples like I gave before, you usually see it in this kind of simplified way with 2 or 3 stimuli. That's really important because it helps us sort of explain the basic principles of RFT, the combinatorial entailment and mutual entailment transformation. We can do that with just 3 stimuli, but that doesn't mean that those are the only levels that we care about. So there's actually a nice model, the hyperdimensional model here that talks about different levels that we see. So at the simplest level, it's just 2 stimuli. With 2 stimuli, you can get mutual entailment like you saw, but you can't get combinatorial entailment. So you can't have kind of a relational frame at that more basic level. Just above that, with more complexity, when you have 3 or more stimuli, then you can have relational framing with all the fun entailments and transformation of stimulus functions. But beyond that, you can start to build these relations into networks, and those networks can be linked to each other. So you can get to relational networking, and then relating of relations, and then even relating of these relational networks. And in that higher level, when we talk about relating relations, that's kind of when we talk about basic metaphors, that's where they live. So using a kind of classic example from ACT of a metaphor, what we're doing, we've got one relation like struggling in quicksand is like drowning. That's one relation. And we have another relation where struggling with anxiety is like panic, right? And then we have this additional horizontal relations where we are linking these 2 things. So in this case, what we would be trying to do is we'd have one metaphor, right? The physical metaphor that people may or may not be familiar with quicksand, that like struggling in quicksand is like drowning, and that may cause unnecessary suffering, right? We want that to be our vehicle, and we're going to use that to target something that is a little bit more abstract, because we want to change the way that people maybe relate to their own experience of struggling with anxiety. So we would say, Struggling with anxiety is like struggling in quicksand. And if this works, the relation on the right that people already have, the sort of, I know what this is like, I know what to do, I know that struggling isn't helpful, actually transfers over, and we get a transformation of how that second relation on the left works, such that people realize maybe the response they were making before was more like struggle, and maybe there's a new response that's more helpful here, like to not struggle. So that's how we get those kind of higher levels. And there's a lot more you can say about metaphor, but I just wanted to show that that level of metaphor is like relating these relations. And above that, we might even have very complicated kind of verbal relations, essentially stories, and we are relating stories. So when we work with narratives, we are relating relational networks. So that's important to think about clinically. Obviously, if our clients can work at those higher levels, that might be useful because we can get more transformation of relations more quickly if we can work at the relating relations or relating story level. But not all clients have that fluency, and so we may need to scale down and focus on the level where they're at. And in some cases, if people don't even have the capacity reliably to do relational framing, that's where we would do intervention and actually teach them those relational framing skills such that we could then see arbitrarily applicable relational responding and start to do some of the more kind of classic sort of what looks like psychotherapy work, where we're working with these kind of relational frames of these relational networks only when people have them and are able to use them in useful ways. So a couple of variables to kind of think about whenever you're working with verbal networks at whatever level of complexity. Uh, One variable is derivation. So how many times has this thing been practiced? So the first time you sort of complete that and you sort of compare Kennewick to Pasco, the first time you do that, it's newly derived. But over time, if you practice that a lot, you don't have to go through the derivation. You're just practicing. Kennewick's more fun than Pasco. And so derivation over time can decrease and become more automatic. Complexity is related to how many items and relations are in the network. So obviously they can become more complex. Coherence here, we just mean how consistent is what we are seeing in this verbal response consistent with the previous history. So if someone has been telling themselves for a long time that they are worthless, when you say, tell me something that, you know, makes you feel like you're worthwhile, like that coherence of, I'm good at sports, that makes me worthwhile. That is going to be kind of not as coherent as somebody who maybe has historically felt that they're worthwhile and is maybe now just doubting it. So coherence is how much it matches up with past history. And then flexibility is referring to how easily is this pattern altered when we try it, right? So um, a fun example is to sort of play that game of opposite day, like today's opposite day, like I hate it here. This is no fun. Really meaning I like it here. This is fun. You see how quickly people might be able to do that. But in some of those cases, when you talk about like the worthwhile, worthless thing, if you say, "Hey, why don't we just flip this around?" and you start talking about yourself as if you're a worthwhile person, you may see a different kind of pattern of flexibility than just when you're talking about opposite day. So those are some of the kind of dimensions that you'll want to watch for or think about as you're working with these verbal networks. And then just some takeaways about how can we work with these verbal networks, whether we're talking about classic relational frames or if we're talking about bigger metaphors or stories. So we recognize that we can create new networks. So we can create new things. And in some ways we take advantage of that. So for example, even though we talk a lot about acceptance, acceptance has a long history for a lot of people and maybe not is actually that helpful for us, right? And so rather than fighting and being like, I want to say acceptance, but only in my sort of therapist-y way, don't bring your old history of acceptance into there, right? That might not be helpful. We could lose a lot of time fighting against their definition of acceptance, their history, and the history we want. So we might use a word like willingness instead. Why? Because people don't have a lot of history with the word willingness. So if we use willingness as that and we teach the functions that we want with sort of therapeutic acceptance with willingness, we might get a better result than trying to kind of retrain people and fight the old established functions of acceptance if those are at odds with how we want them to be using acceptance in the room with us. So we can create totally new networks. We can always elaborate on existing networks, so we can add more stimuli. We can try to add new functions. We can elaborate the network to include more things. We can try to connect or relate separate networks, so we can bring them together. These are sort of the same thing, or they have some shared properties. So we can bring them together if that's useful. And we can try to transform the way that the network works. So some of the ways we might want to do it is neutralize it, right? So when we think about like cognitions, right, we don't necessarily want to say like, tell me your cognition. Okay, let me fight cognition one. Okay, what's cognition two? Let me fight cognition two. What we want to do is say, cognitions are just sort of what the mind does. And we're just going to kind of notice what the mind is doing and not necessarily engage with it. And by doing that, if we put that in that network, we can neutralize the impact of thousands and thousands, infinite variety of cognitions by just saying they're part of a larger network, right? Of called what we would call like the mind, and then try to neutralize or change the way that people respond to the contents of their mind, right? So respond with curiosity, right, rather than a sense of having to control or change what their mind does. So we can neutralize. We can try to flip or modify the psychological function. So he's like using metaphors there, right? The psychological function of anxiety is like anxiety and struggle are in that kind of relation. We may try to change that network through some other kind of transformation, right? So that's why we use the metaphor, right, of talking about struggling with anxiety as like struggling in quicksand. We're trying to modify the psychological functions of that relationship between struggling and anxiety, and maybe not directly training it, but trying to get this transformation of stimulus functions through this experiential knowledge that people have of what it's like to actually struggle with a physical thing like quicksand. And another key transformation that we want to be alive to is that we can embed one network inside the other one. So we can put smaller networks inside larger networks and focus on trying to transform or have useful functions of that larger network. So that sort of diffusion metaphor of sort of, your thoughts are just aspects of what your mind does. They're things that your mind does. Just consider them as sort of products of your mind. We are embedding all those specific cognitions into a larger category called the mind, and then we're trying to train useful ways to relate to that larger network called the mind, right? Such that we get potentially like more flexibility with people in places where, if they historically, if that kind of cognition had been identified, they would have responded to it in, maybe kind of behavior narrowing ways. And we don't ask them to like not notice the thought or change the thought. We just say, think of it as a product of your mind. Your mind is not your enemy here. So let's just let your mind sort of do its thing, and you don't need to engage in, challenging or struggling with that thought. So embedding in networks is a really useful application of RFT. We should recognize that we cannot permanently cut an existing part of the network. So we don't have an eliminationist agenda, right? There's no delete button in the nervous system, right? If someone has told themselves once or a million times that they are worthless, we can't pretend that we're going to be able to cut that out and only have them think worthwhile things going forward, right? We can build that new worthwhile network, and we can find new ways to work with worthlessness when it shows up. But we need to give up the idea that we are going to go in and surgically kind of delete the worthless bit and keep the worthwhile bit. As far as we know, we don't know how to do it. We also shouldn't aim to create or transform networks that strengthen experiential avoidance or experiential clinging. So we can add new networks, right? We can give clients rules, and we can give them other things to do and ways of relating in the world. We can tell them that they should just learn to cope with that. But we have to be careful, right? Because we can create any network we want, but we should be careful knowing the risks of having excessive experiential avoidance or excessive rule following, right? That we don't want to create new networks or strengthen networks, reinforce networks that are already telling people that experiential avoidance or experiential clinging is the answer, or that tell people that there's like that they've got to get to a capital T truth, right? Or they've got to follow the rules perfectly. If we tell them some version of, you're not following the rules perfectly, follow these rules perfectly, we are potentially going to create more problems, right? So we want to be thoughtful about the way that we are delivering this and to try to uh, minimize the unhelpful properties of the verbal networks and add in new verbal networks that have this quality of kind of functional coherence of helping people get to the workable answer and not replace it with just some capital T truth from their therapist. So RFT changes the world. I'm using a clip here. This is an image from the movie Free Guy, right, where this sort of non-playable character in a video game discovers these or glasses, and when he puts the glasses on, he sort of sees all this stuff in the world, in his world, that he hadn't seen before. All these hidden side quests, and money and health things that he can acquire. And RFT is kind of like that. Once you develop this ability to do arbitrarily applicable relational responding, you start to see new functions in the world. You start relating to your world through these glasses. And what's interesting is to note is just how quickly and how pervasive this is. So it's not hard, like if I asked you to solve a complicated, logic puzzle, you'd go slow, I think, unless you were good at it. But like little kids, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years old, as they start to get these things, they start to relate to these. They start to do this relating so quickly and so fluently that they don't even notice. Right? It's like a fish that doesn't even notice they're in the water, which is why it's so hard for people to, I think, to notice and respond effectively to this kind of derived relational responding that they're doing. They can't even see very easily that that they're wearing these glasses. So RFT comes and it changes your world. And we still have those other basic processes. We still have Pavlovian conditioning. We still have operant conditioning. Um, but they interact and it changes them. We still have those 4 basic functions of behavior, right? So getting tangibles and sensory and avoiding or escaping demands. But once those processes, once relating is in place, it changes it, and we can't predict as well what people are going to do based on those four basic functions. We need to account for the impact of relational responding, right? And so our interventions need to go in the same way. So it's like in the movie when they put on the glasses. Once they have the glasses on there, we need to be responding to them in those ways. And so we need interventions that can handle kind of functional analysis that includes those 4 basic functions, but also how they're impacted by this relational responding. And so there are some key RFT applications here. So if this is operant behavior, right, we know that operant behavior can be trained and shaped. And so that's been really useful to think about language and cognition as the development of increased fluency with relational framing. And some of the folks that have developed applications, Sarah Cassidy and her team have Raise Your IQ. And so this uses kind of a gamified version of learning how to increasingly use sophisticated verbal relational framing. And as you do that, you start to see meaningful changes in academic performance. And you also, as it says, you get to see an increase in IQ, because a lot of what IQ testing is actually testing ability to use kind of relational framing in complicated ways. And so we can have a larger discussion about whether IQ is the be all and end all of things to aim for, but it is cool. Not many things change or raise IQ. It's cool to see something that's targeted that can increase this, and that has important applications or and meaningful changes in people's lives beyond just IQ testing. The other folks that are doing a lot of this work are Mark Dixon and his team out of Peak and Emergent Learning Academy. So Peak is really teaching, testing and teaching all of these kind of RFT skills. So maybe starting from very direct training, if people don't have mutual entailment, teaching that, to combinatorial entailment, and then various kinds of transformations of stimulus functions. So that by the end, people are using a lot of different kinds of relational frames fluently, and they're having responses that are sensitive to the actual relational frames in front of them. So it's not just kind of memorized rote learning of responses in response to questions, but actually relating to stimuli based on their properties, which is what we want in kind of naturalistic things. So, of course, once people have those abilities, they can then kind of go to the past, go to the future, imagine bad things, worry about things, and so they have all the problems of folks that have more sophisticated um, relational framing, and there we need some kind of intervention, basically to deal with those kinds of derived relational um, framings where we get stuck in having kind of fixed rules about that we're following, or fixed concepts of ourselves, or unhelpful responses to our thoughts and feelings. So we need peak to kind of get there, and then once we're there, we need aim or some kind of other act intervention to help make sure that we are responding effectively to these new uh, relational networks that we are getting fluency with. There's a lot more reading you can do in depth if you want to kind of continue developing competency with RFT. Nicholas Turnicky has a lot of books on the basic learning processes, including RFT and the ABCs of human behavior. And then there's metaphor-specific books, are really looking at how metaphors are used in clinical practice, and also using functional analysis, so using RFT to do the functional analysis in psychotherapy. Siri Ming colleagues have a book on using RFT to promote generalization in language, so kind of those language development skills similar to Sarah Cassidy's group. One interesting take on kind of RFT in clinical use is in Mastering the Clinical Conversation. Has a lot of examples of how you could use RFT to have pretty abstract conversations about sort of values and perspective and goal setting, that kind of thing. And then the Handbook of Contextual Behavioral Science is sort of the canonical work. There's a couple of descriptions of RFT, so that's a good place to go to make sure that you are understanding kind of the key principles and that's making sense in a more technical way. Um, I would also encourage you, if you are feeling a little bit of shaky about RFT, I don't know if I'm not sure if I really get it. I would say go back and just take those two examples, like the nickel and the dime example, or the Tri-Cities example. Like, actually go and find a family member or a friend, and walk through and kind of teach them the skills. I think if you teach the principles of RFT in that way, you'll start to see where you're getting it, and you'll walk away feeling like, okay, I've got a basic kind of feel for it. And then, of course, you can continue to develop that as you think about more complicated kinds of relational frames and the actual applications in session. But I think you can walk away pretty quickly, sort of going like, I get it. It's not kind of a mystery what the basic idea of RFT is. And that would be quite a win. And then just before I go, I'll take time to do a kind of a tiny rant. Sometimes I get a chance to do that. This doesn't happen so much in ACT and behavioral analytics spaces, but in the general psychotherapy space, I often feel like I'm running into people that are talking about quote unquote talk therapy in contrast to something else, usually some kind of somatic approach or some other perspective on therapy. And one of the things that I really wonder about for those folks is what is left, whatever kind of point they're trying to make, how does it sort of jibe with relational frame theory, right? Because if we see that, like, this capacity, right, for very complicated um, verbal relating, that is not just about kind of cognitive stuff, but also, like we saw in the experimental example, that like people are relating in this very somatic way, right? The A is less than B is less than C, small a, middle B, people are reacting as if they're going to get a big C shock, right? Like, and that's a skin conductance response. So we're actually seeing these psychological functions. Now, RFT is going to determine, like in the experimental group, they respond to C as if it's going to be big, but they don't in the control group because they didn't have the relational framing. But my point is, there's a lot of these psychological functions that RFT has a lot to say about. And also, we saw that, like, very quickly, once RFT gets kind of onboarded, it changes your whole world. And so you can't really go back. Like, yes, you can do an experiential activity, you can have session be quiet, But relational framing doesn't go away. That person is there going like, "Okay, I'm gonna do this thing that my therapist said. I wonder if it'll help. I hope it helps me with my anxiety. I wonder if it's good, I'll use it tomorrow." Like, they're relationally framing all the time. And so people are making this kind of topographic distinction about sort of talk therapy. I think they mean very kind of cognitive, a lot of talking, and they're contrasting it to other topographies like, you know, music or something like that. But I'm not really sure what their claim is, and I'm not sure how much of their claim really makes sense in the light of RFT. And that's what I would sort of encourage people to sort of say is like, how does this work with RFT? And if they don't really know RFT or if they can't give you kind of an answer, I think it's not that useful a distinction in most cases. Like, it's just kind of a topographic distinction. At the end of the day, there's a lot of relational framing going on, and we're going to need some way to do that. Experiential, yes, there's a lot of like a lot of wisdom to doing experiential practices, but 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 also like thinking about how that lands with these basic behavioral processes. Why do we do this? Well, because one of the things that's great about kind of mindfulness is it helps us catch what those verbal networks are and to potentially work with them in different ways. And so it's very practical. And that's what I kind of wonder is like, what it's an important question. Like, what is in the kind of more somatic or in the more experiential place? I think that's a good question for the field. But I think a lot of those people kind of that I hear raising those points, I'm not sure have a basic understanding of RFT. And so therefore, I don't really know how their question makes sense for someone who's taking kind of a functional contextual act perspective, because obviously like relational framing is going to be massively involved once it gets online, and we have to work with that. So that is the end of my rant for today. Thank you for listening.